Good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Barbara Kern, co-director of the Science Libraries Division here at the University of Chicago, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the John Crerar Library and to the 2014 Kathleen A. Czar Symposium. The theme this year, as all of you know, is data, something that's very much on all of our minds. I'd like to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about the Symposium series. The Kathleen A. Czar Symposium is a biennial event. This is our third one. Every year the theme changes, and in this way we allow it to stay very relevant and timely to what's happening and what's affecting all of us. And that's most certainly true today for data. The symposium is always held here in the John Crerar Library in the Kathleen A. Czar room in this wonderful space. And both the symposium and the room are named in memory of Kathleen A. Czar, who's the former director of the Science Libraries Division, and both are supported by her family and friends. I'm also pleased to let you know that thanks to recently received funds from support from the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health, and Department of Health and Human Services, this symposium is being live webcast, so welcome to everyone watching it remotely. And it is also being taped and will be available for viewing in the future, and we will send out an email to everyone to let you know when that's available. Before we begin, I just want to introduce two individuals in the room. Elizabeth Long, who's the Associate University Librarian for Digital Services, and Deb Werner, who's our Librarian for Science Instruction and Outreach. Elizabeth and Deb are both on the Symposium Organizing Committee. You will see them throughout the day. If you have any questions or need directions or anything, you can grab them, you can grab me. Any staff here in the library will be happy to help you. Very quickly, some housekeeping for you. The restrooms, you're probably all wondering where they are. They're back out in the atrium through the glass doors and to your right-hand side. Lunch today will be in the library. It will be downstairs, and we'll have staff directing you where to go. And in your packages is something called a meeting ID, which will allow you to get access to all of the library computers, as well as wireless on your laptops, if you'd like. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to present our first speaker. John Bollen is an associate professor at Indiana University's School of Informatics and Computing. He was formerly a staff scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory from 2005 to 2009, and an assistant professor at the Department of Computer Science of Old Dominion University from 2002 to 2005. He obtained his PhD in experimental psychology from the Vrije University in Brussels in 2001. He has published more than 75 articles on computational social science, social media analytics, informametrics, and digital libraries. His research has been funded by the NSF, IARPA, and Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Johan lives in Bloomington, Indiana with his wife and daughter, and in his free time, he enjoys P90X and DJing in the local Bloomington clubs as DJ Angst with his colleague E. Trash, aka Louis Roshi. There we go. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention that one of the reasons why I'll be heading out at noon is because I need to get back to Bloomington, because I do actually have a gig tonight, and there'll be hordes of ecstasy-fueled crowds waiting for my appearance. No, that's, I mean, we don't condone that. So, you know, I thought a little bit about this presentation, and I saw that the theme of the symposium was data, you know, collection and management, and I do a lot of that. But I don't do it necessarily from the perspective of being of a librarian, but from the perspective of what they call computational social science. Now, my background is in psychology, but I specialized in robotics and data mining very early on, and that's how I, at Los Alamos National Laboratory and before, became interested in data mining, very large-scale usage data records as they're collected by the world's libraries and publishers, etc., and to use that data to detect and to measure scientific activity at a very early stage when it's just being when the scientists themselves, in fact, are often not aware of what's driving their thinking and their action. So in a sense, I do a lot of data collection, a lot of data management, but I do that from the perspective of conducting a scientific program and to achieve certain objectives. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our uses of big data in this realm. I'm going to talk a lot about network science because I think that well, not just because I'm interested in network science, but I think it could inform a lot of big data. Notice that there's no caps on the big data. I really don't like that term, to be honest. I've had people ask me, so where does big data live? As if he's got like a mansion in California someplace overlooking the ocean. But we'll talk a little about network science, especially because I'm very interested in the kind of networks that scientists and scholars weave, not just in their daily interactions, but also in their online interactions, and what it tells us about science, so that we can study science as a scientific subject in its own right, and conduct a science of science. And I think that is really a revolution that's taking place in front of our own eyes, and that's informing a lot of developments that are taking place right now in infometrics and bibliometrics, and I think that this will be quite interested in that as well. Okay, so first off, I mean, as a scientist, we have sort of very mixed feelings about how science is funded and how administrators evaluate science. Right, on one end, we're constantly, genuflecting in front of our masters who are doling out the cash that we need to conduct our research with, right? And it doesn't always feel equally uplifting, right? To be sending project proposals. I mean, it's a little bit like talking to a girl in the bar and making all kinds of promises, and whispering all kinds of sweet words into her ears. It's not always a very uplifting event. So the other thing I wanted to say is that people who hold the purse strings, right? The princes of ye old O&R in this case, in the cartoon, they of course are not going to hand out money freely. They're going to want to have some idea of who they're handing the money out to, and whether those individuals or their track records are worthy of investing in that sense. And then on the other hand, you've got administrators who perhaps, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but in many cases are too lazy to actually, or not aware of the science to really get involved in conducting an actual peer review, right? Because for peer review, you need peers. And administrators at many universities aren't peers. They're administrators. And so the situation that you often get in is that people are looking at metrics of scholarly performance, if you will, and you get into these kind of situations where my son's math score is 342.736, and that's one additional number past the decimal point. So just to give you a sort of a view of a little bit of my bias when it comes to science, I've got a very sort of exalted idea of science. I know a lot of people don't share that with me, but I think it's one of the few areas in life where we don't operate in terms of what you would normally expect in sort of a capitalist economy that's based on paying people for services. As a scientist, I don't feel like I am rendering services and people pay me to do so. Right? I feel like I'm more part of the gift economy in which I generate ideas and I give those ideas as freely as possible. And my status in the community is derived from people accepting those ideas and then passing those ideas on themselves. Right? And that's very much like the old gift economies that people found in the Washington area among Native Americans that lived there, where I studied anthropology, so I'm not an expert in anthropology, but I remember from this, it really struck me, is that they had these meetings called potlatches every year. And the idea of a potlatch was that you'd bring as many goods as you could to the potlatch and then distribute them freely, or even destroy them if no one would take them, just to show your status and your willingness to share with the tribe and other tribes the possessions that you had acquired. Right? We don't do that anymore, you might have noticed. Right? But in tribes, it makes a lot of sense. If I kill a bison, I'm not going to eat the whole bison. I mean, I've got a wicked appetite, but I'm not going to eat an entire bison. So I'm going to distribute the bison. And whoever gets some bison meat from me is going to say, I like Johan Bollen. He fed me. He can kill a bison. Watch out for that guy. So that's kind of what happens with these potlatches in sort of an implicit manner. And that's also what happens in science. I generate an idea. I pass the idea on. And when people acknowledge that idea, saying, oh, you know, Johan Bollen, wrote a paper, I cited that paper, looks really good. Well, now I'm acknowledged, now my status has increased. And so when you start printing scientific results and people start citing, that becomes part of the publication, people start citing those results, then what you have is essentially a gift economy in place, right? I give the ideas, and what do I get in return? Citations, which are acknowledgement. So it becomes really natural for people in bibliometrics and people interested in scholarly evaluation to look at citation records. This happens all the time. You know, people, for example, when we have candidates coming in for interviews, I'm not saying that it's part of the official procedure, but it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people went on Google Scholar right away and looked at the citation record of that particular candidate. And this happens throughout the world. It's actually tied to income. It's tied to incentives, etc. So the notion is simple. We print scientific results. We share them as freely as possible. And then fellow scientists start to cite them, which is sort of the ultimate acknowledgement of influence, because the ideas are being cited and acknowledged on print, right? It's cast in stone once that happens. And so naturally, the more citations someone has, the greater the influence. So here's an example of the typical kind of services that you'd see. I'm sure that I hope I'm not boring you to death with stuff you already know about. But this is sort of a typical thing that you do. You look at a bunch of papers and you look through the reference data to see how often it's been cited. And then you can rank papers according to which has the most citations, which has the least citations, etc. And that gives us information. Of course, we can tie that to the authors. So you can see that S. Schenker here has 21,963 citations. That's very good. That's a lot of citations. So this guy apparently killed a lot of bisons, and he's got a very happy tribe. Now, again, we can do this for the individual papers as well. Right? We can even do this for the journals that those papers have been published in. Because if you publish a lot of papers that are cited a lot, well, it perhaps tells us something about the value of that journal as an aggregate of a bunch of papers. Now, the one thing I wanted to mention here is that it's not quite, you've already seen how complicated this gets right off the bat, right? First I had a simple story, killing bisons, acknowledgement. You print papers, you get cited. But what are we evaluating, right? So we've got authors that we can evaluate on the basis of citations. We've got articles, journals. We can do entire domains. We can actually say computer science is very productive right now because it's getting a lot of citations in the past 3 years, right? And in entire countries. And I've seen this kind of analysis where, for example, you know, people made arguments like Spanish scientists have been cited a lot in the past couple of years. So the Minister of Education or the National Science Funding Organization is doing a great job because they're being very productive. So, and again, on the basis of what kind of acknowledgement? So first we've got the entities, right? So I'm always thinking in terms of sort of predicates, right? Entities, relationships. Okay, so we've got our entities. There's a bunch of them that we can evaluate. Second, what kind of acknowledgement? Well, citation, obviously. I've just been talking about it for at least 10 minutes now. But there's other expressions of influence, impact, and attention. It could be an informal conversation by the water cooler. It could be, for example, if I wrote a software library that a lot of scientists would use in their analysis, and a lot of people downloaded that software library, well, that's a form of influence, right? That's actually a tremendously important part of influence. Online usage data, we've looked at that. A lot of people have actually recently been starting to look at the social media acknowledgement. You know, I've seen this with one of my papers. If it attracts a lot of attention, it starts to sort of cascade through the social media environment. People start to retweet your paper, right? And that could be used potentially as a form of impact indicator. And I'll show you some results that indicate that this might actually be feasible in a number of cases. And then you've got explicit indicators like bookmarking, like in Mendeley or Zotero. You know, people bookmark a paper, you've got those records, and that indicates that people say, well, I definitely want to read this. I want to keep track of that paper in my own personal library, right? Okay, so that's two things. So we've got what are we evaluating? The entities, right? Then we're looking at the relationships between those entities. Right? In a tribe, they could be social, they could be explicit, there's a number of ways of operationalizing these kind of relationships. Then the third is what dimension of impact are we really measuring? And I remember a while ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, I got a lot of attention for a paper that I published on predicting the stock market. So I was asked to appear on television quite a bit to tell, you know, but probably they wanted stock tips. And I don't think they were interested in me. I just wanted to get right to it, you know. But, I mean, that's a form of impact. And as a scholar, I feel, you know, I mean, it sounds really pretentious to call myself a scholar, but since I've called myself a DJ, I can just as well call myself a scholar. That's a form of impact. I think we as academics, we stand in the world, and I'm very much in favor of sort of the citizen scientist. And by that I mean scientists that are willing to go out and talk about what matters to them, even when that puts them in the realm of social media, the media in general, or even politics. So again, what dimension of impact are we measuring? Are we just counting indicators? Well, that's one thing, but we can also look at network structure. I'm going to show you some really smart tricks that network scientists have been applying to this kind of data on all levels that can get us much, much closer to something that intuitively corresponds to what we would understand as impact. This is my background in psychology, right? I mean, you can measure intelligence in 1,000 different ways, right? And some of them are better than others, clearly. Okay, so network science and citation data. So this is a graph that that we produced. It's based on the journal citation reports, right? And what we did is very simply, we took a bunch of journals. If the papers in one journal cite the papers in the other journal frequently, we connect them. We connect the dots on this graph, right? And then we use a graph layout algorithm to spread it out really nicely. Sort of it's sort of a force-directed placement algorithm where they repel each other, they kind of attract each other by their links. And what you get is a map like this. And it's very clear that if you publish a journal as a publisher and that journal is over here or over here, it might not have as much influence as a journal that is right over here, right? Obviously, because this journal here is cited a lot by a whole bunch of journals in its domain, right? Well, journals don't cite journals, but I use it as a shorthand for saying that the articles published in the journal cite, you know, etc. So this journal, clearly very important. That one there is very high influence as well, but that one over there, perhaps not so high influence. So immediately we see from the network visually that it's not just about the number, the sheer number of citations that you receive, but where those citations are coming from. If you receive a couple of citations that put you right in the middle of this cluster, even though there might not only be a few of them, right? What that means is that your impact is quite high because you're connected to all of the right journals, right? If you're in the outskirts, you can still have 3 or 4 citations more than that journal, but your influence would be lower. So naturally, network science has developed a whole bunch of metrics that are being used to determine the impact along a number of different dimensions of entities in a graph like this. And that's what we've been doing quite a bit. So I mean, I hope this isn't getting too technical, but so there's different network metrics that we can rely on in network science. And you know, most of you use Google, I presume, at least from time to time. There's also Bing, same principle. But Google got started by essentially, instead of just counting how many hyperlinks pointed to a paper, which is what we do in citation analysis now, how many citations point to the journal or the paper. What Google started doing is looking at where those citations came from, right? So if I received a citation from Albert Einstein, I'd be done. That one citation, that would be enough, right? Albert Einstein saying, I like that paper, Bollen wrote a great paper, thank you. That would be enough, that would be enough. That would be the biggest bison I could ever kill, right? But it would be just one citation. So a review board would count the number of citations I've received over my career and just say, Bollen is no good. Yeah, no, sure, he got it, you know, Albert Einstein liked what he did, but he's got one citation, no tenure. Okay, so that would be a really dumb thing to do, right? What we need to go towards in citation analysis, and I've been arguing this for quite a few years, is that we need to leverage the results that have been attained in network science over the past 40 or 50 years and apply them to the evaluation of scholars, because then we have a computational perspective that really matters. I mean, the mathematics of some of these metrics are very interesting and very powerful and allow us to get much closer to a true sense of impact that includes both notions of how popular you are overall. You know, you could be the Britney Spears of citation data, right? But also to acknowledge that it matters where those citations come from, what the structure, the topology of that citation network looks like. So there's been a whole bunch of different network metrics that emerge in social network analysis and network science. The simplest ones are in degree and out degree. So that's just counting how many citations go from me to other people and how many citations come from other people to me. Very simple, just citation counting, right? But at least you've got an idea of the directionality involved. Okay, so then there's what we call random walk networks, which I am really fascinated by because of their mathematics. I mean, just really beautiful metrics. And what you do is you take the citation network and you essentially simulate what if you would just jump from one paper to the next in a citation network, just randomly. And you do that ad infinitum, right? On which pages would we expect you to spend the most time? What papers would we expect you to spend the most time mathematically? Those papers have the highest impact. Think about it. It's a fantastic metric, right? So it's called a random walk metric. This is what Google uses to rank, well, used to use to rank web pages with. It's also very strongly related to notions of eigenvector centrality. Well, no, not strongly related. It is eigenvector centrality in social network analysis. There's other metrics that I like a lot as well. For example, you can look at closeness. So instead of just looking at direct citations like in degree, we could, for example, say that you cited this gentleman, you cited her, and she cited me, right? So that means there's a path, an indirect path, and we can take those into account when we calculate the in degree. So what is the length of those paths pointing to me? That's a really interesting metric as well. Or even more interesting, how many of the shortest paths between all of us pass to someone individually? That person is central to the network because all of the shortest paths pass through that person. If you take that person out of the graph dies, it crumbles, right? So in terrorist networks, you look at who calls whom, build that network, look at the person with the highest between-us centrality, and that's where you direct the drone attack to. That's the person you take out because you disrupt that network. So I'm not talking about drone attacks and scientists here, but I'm talking about a mechanism to find scientists that are central to that structure, even if their citation counts aren't very high. So we've done all of that. So there's a myriad of metrics, and I won't go into sort of the details of all of them, but you know, I'll definitely talk about some of the efforts that have been around for quite a while. They've been using these kind of thoughts or ideas to rank a variety of different actors in these citation networks. The first one, how many of you know about the impact factor and how it's calculated? Just to get a show of hands. Most of you do? Okay, we've got to play. So I won't dwell on it. I'll talk a little bit about the eigenfactor, which is a really interesting, I would say call it an aberration, but another way to rank journals. The H-index, I'll talk a little bit about that. The counter, which is not really a metric, but it's a project that I think is really cool. And then I'll talk, I mean, it's a shameless plug, I'll talk about my measure project, which I think did some really radical and very innovative work. And we'll go into the alt metrics a little bit because that really gets us into social media and social media networks. So most of you know, impact factor is calculated, it's an average 2-year citation rate for a journal, right? And it's totally simple. The one thing that is, if we look at it from a network perspective, if you look at, for example, the JCR citation graph, and one journal citing the other journal, what we end up with is about 10 million weighted edges. It's a directed weighted graph. In fact, it's a very atypical kind of graph because citation edges point backwards in time. It's a little bit like a time machine, right? Where we are right now on the citation graphs, we're looking back in time towards publications that are sort of the antecedents of the papers that were published today. Right? So essentially, if you look at it as a graph, you see time at the bottom, and what's the impact factor? It's what I just mentioned. It's a normalized in degree. We count the number of citations that point to a journal, and we normalize that by the number of papers published. It's a normalized in degree. That's all it's doing. So it's one of the most basic social network metrics of importance that we could possibly calculate. I haven't even gotten out of the gates yet. You know, it's just, yeah, it's citation counting. Now, it's frequently used. I know that this is used quite a bit, and what scares me a lot is it's not just used to rank journals, to get an idea of how important a journal is. It's used by extension to measure the scholarly impact of authors, of papers, of departments, of countries, and I must, in the strongest possible terms, object to that practice. I mean, statistically, it's bogus. It's bogus. It cannot and must not be done. The reason for that being very simple, I am not arguing with the impact factor as sort of a reasonable indicator of the importance of a journal, but since the distributions of citations within a journal to the papers published in the journal are so skewed and so unequal, just averaging it out is not a good way of comparing articles or the impact of articles. Even worse, then you try to sort of average it out by the author, right? Which is even worse. You can't do it. It's a little bit like saying that, for example, the U.S. is richer than Sweden. You know, if you calculate an average income for the U.S., it's higher than Sweden. Right? The reason for that is that we've got Bill Gates skewing that average all the way up to, you know, where it is no longer reflective of the U.S. population. Right? It's really simple statistics if you think about it. So, anyway, it's used in a whole bunch of settings. again, I don't want to, it's become very fashionable to be hating on the impact factor. It's good for what it is. I think even Thomson Reuters, you know, they're good scientists. They know what it should be used for. They've cautioned against it. So it's not like, you know, I'm essentially kicking in an open door, right? And I do believe, though, that the impact factor is a typical sort of instance of what H.L. Mencken once said. For every complex problem, there's a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And that's kind of what we have with the impact factor. Right? Administrators start using the impact factor, they like it because it's really simple, right? Count citations, divide the number of papers. That's what the impact factor of the journal is, and you're done, right? Well, it's neat, simple, and wrong. So I don't think it's appropriate. Now, okay, so a little bit of mathematics. I hope this kind of works out for you. So here's the idea, right? We've got the impact factor. And so we've got citations pointing from one journal to the next. And we count the in degree and divide it by the number of papers published. Okay, great. So let's take a slightly different route. So instead of counting number of citations, we use the citations not as an indicator of acknowledgement. What we do is we use the citations as a conduit to transfer influence from one journal to the next. This is the Albert Einstein cites Johann Bollen mode of thinking. Albert Einstein cites me. Why does that matter? Well, because Albert Einstein is the god of science, so to speak. He's the king of science. If he cites me, he transfers some of his importance to me, right? However, if he cites 1 million people, I should only get 1/1,000,000th of the credit, right? I should get only 1/1,000,000th of the value of Albert Einstein because he's been pretty promiscuous in citing everybody, okay? So that's the reasoning here. So let's look at the impact factor. So we do something very simple. We say we take the impact factor of a journal, and we calculate it as the sum of the impact factors of the journal that cite that journal. Okay? So if all of you are citing me, and Albert Einstein is there, then his citation will carry a lot more weight. He will transfer some of his impact to me. Okay? Note that this is circular. Right? So who defines Albert Einstein's impact? Well, it's exactly the same way. But okay, now we've got a random walk because now we've gone to Albert Einstein. How do we evaluate Albert Einstein? Well, okay, we evaluate by the people that cite him, right? And now the importance is circulating through network. And mathematically, you can kind of show that in most networks that will converge on a stationary distribution, given that certain conditions are met, right? I won't get into the details here, but you can fiddle around with giving everybody sort of a base level of importance, and then transferring the rest, just making sure the network stays connected and that everybody is reachable by the impact of others, etc. And what we end it up with is a sort of a formula like this, an equation like this, which is Google's PageRank. So we went from something very basic that doesn't take into account where the citations are coming from, who is citing whom, right? That doesn't acknowledge the network topology one bit, and by some really basic thinking, we arrived at something that is as sophisticated as eigenvector centrality in social networks. So why don't we? Well, a lot of people have actually done that. If you go to my colleagues of eigenvector, that's more or less what they do. How many of you know about eigenvectors that are not two people? Okay, good. So this is a website where you can go to, and that's essentially what they did. They have the citation data for journals, and they run the kind of calculations that are sketched. So they're not counting total number of citations. They pass the importance along until it kind of converges, stabilizes. And that's what they use as a metric of the importance of a journal. The more you think about it, the better it gets. Really. It's a fantastic idea. It really is. Now, I think this is a powerful metric that fixes many of the shortcomings of the impact factor based on solid network science. They also take into the eigenvector people actually take a longer citation period into account, 5 years, which clearly is a little more representative than just 2 years, given citation delays, etc. And I think that what I really like about the eigenvector people is that they're not just running the calculations, which is something that we used to do. They actually have very compelling visualizations to show you these networks, and you can see nodes swell and shrink as their importance goes up and down. It's really cool. Right. The only and these are really minor points, but the only problem is that I've tried to explain PageRank to so many people now, and I've struggled to really communicate it effectively, unless people understand the mathematics. And the reason for that is because it's circular. You don't have sort of it's not like you've got the Thomson Reuters descending Mount Sinai with the stone tablets of impact and handing them down to the people saying, "Here we go, nature, good." Lots of citations. Right? And that is easy to understand for people, but that's not how it should work. I've just shown you mathematically and by logic that it's not a very complete indication of impact, right? But how do you explain a procedure where we're going to go, well, we'll just pass it around and then, you know, it converges. Trust us, we're mathematicians. Converges, and that's impact. A lot of people have trouble with that, and administrators are, you know, find that really difficult to accept, right? So that's why I think the acceptance of these kind of metrics has not been as swift as I would have expected, judging from their merit. Now, the one metric that mostly, how many of you are aware of the H-index here? Everybody? Okay, so I won't even dwell on it. So this is a metric that directly tries to fix the issue with these citation distributions being so skewed. And it's trying to find, instead of calculating an average, it's trying to find sort of a middle point in the distribution that is more or less representative. Again, I mean, this is 2005, so it's been a while. But it's very simple, and this is being used all the time. I have to be totally honest. I monitor my own H-index. It grows over time. So that's really satisfying. You don't have to do anything for it because as your publications get older, they achieve more citations, and the distribution kind of nicely gets skewed upward. And as it's being cut in half, that halfway point just gets better and better, right? So it's nice. But I think it's really nice because it redefines impact. It redefines an author's impact based on not how many citations you've gathered, but on your productivity as well as on your impact, as indicated by the distribution, the shape of the distribution of your citation numbers. So I think that's really tempting. I won't get into the pros and cons. I think you're all very familiar with these metrics, but the H-index is used all over the place, and I like it because it managed to redefine what we mean by impact. I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, that's not impact. Impact is 2-year citation rate divided by total number. That's impact." This is not impact. Your PageRank stuff and H-index, that's not impact. Okay, fine. Now, you've got sort of a nearly tautological situation. But I like it because it gives us a different perspective. I like the H-index because it gives us a very simple way of getting a pretty sophisticated, sort of redefined notion of impact. Anyway, that's the H-index. So again, I've shown you a whole bunch of metrics, right? They're essentially using citation data. But now we're going to go down the rabbit hole. This is sort of, I think this is sort of old-style bibliometrics. We've got citations, right? And we perform neat tricks with citation networks to get a little closer to what we mean by citations, right? But are citations really the only way to validly determine impact, right? Scholarship is now an online process. Really, I cannot tell you, I mean, I honestly, most of my papers are born digital. They go up on the SSRN or archive very quickly after we've determined that it's valid, and a few colleagues have looked at it and given us some feedback. That's where they live a digital existence. They get quoted on Twitter and Facebook. People pass it around, right? And here we are looking at, you know, for this year's edition of the JCR, and then we start to count citations and do all these neat little tricks. Well, we're much behind the curve. If the thermostat in our house was regulating the temperature based on last year's data, we'd be in big trouble, right? But that's kind of how we monitor scientific impact now, with these citations that necessarily point back in time, right? So here's a diagram that I usually show, and so here's kind of what happened. So here's, at least this is the process for me, right? I've got an idea, I start to read some papers, you know, that fascinate me. I start to do the research, I write the paper, write up my results, I submit them to a journal, it goes through peer review, right? I've got some lots of unkind things to say about that situation, by the way. Peer review, and then it might get rejected, minor revision, major revision, right? The circus continues, and then finally get it published in a peer review journal. A year later, year and a half later, sometimes 2 years later, right? So when we look at citation data derived from citations, we're really looking at science as it existed a couple of years ago. It's like astronomers looking at a galaxy and observing the galaxies that existed 50 million years ago because it's 50 million light years away from us. I mean, I don't know it's 50 million. Yeah, light takes that long, so when we see it, we know that's what it looked like. Anyway, but there's a lot of data being generated while this process is actually taking place. That might give us an early glimpse, like a leading indicator of what might happen later. For example, what I read is very indicative of what I'm interested in right now. And it's also very interesting as an acknowledgement of the impact of the things that I'm reading. So if we can measure what people are reading at a very early stage, it might give us an idea of what I think is important right now. I might not be citing it yet, because to cite it, my paper has to get published first. But I might be reading it right now. Now that could be a pretty good indicator of impact, right? So the scale is also enormous. I mean, Elsevier, announced quite a while ago, nearly a decade ago, they had 1 billion downloads. They achieved the 1 billion download level, right? The entire Web of Science contains about 650 million citations. The scale is just enormous, right? And this is growing exponentially, since so much material is now being published online and accessed online. The citations have become much less important, I think, relative to the scale of this data. Because the immediate coverage, you can do it in real time. And what I think is important is that it's not tied to journal publications or articles. If I publish a software library on GitHub or whatever I do, and it gets downloaded 1 million times, that means that software library is pretty important, right? But it's not a peer-reviewed journal paper. But it is an indication of my impact as a scholar, because it's a scientific library. Okay, so that's why I've been looking a lot in my career at usage data. That is actually measuring what people read online in real time and trying to get like an early indicator of the impact of what they're reading based on that notion. Now, how do we know what people are reading? Server logs. Server logs is the easiest answer. When I access a library service, there's a log. A lot of people don't realize that they're being spied on continuously. There's huge records out there recording what we read, when we read it, what we read after we read this thing, where we read it from, how long we read it. All of that data is available in many of these server logs. It gets even better when you use link resolvers. I use the word spying. It only becomes spying when people start to actually analyze it for nefarious purposes. But in a sense, we leave a trail when we read these things online. Now the question is how to translate that to, excuse me?
Libraries scrub those logs.
Yes, yes. You mean by scrub is that they delete it? Yeah, well, okay. Hold on. Well, anyway, yeah, okay, we'll go into that. So, how to translate these kind of logs to indicators of actual impact? Okay, so let's just assume that the data that we have can identify unique usage events, which means that we know that someone read something at a particular point in time, and we know what they read, right? And that we have a date time stamp down to the second or minute. We've got a unique document ID or enough metadata on the document to sort of deduplicate it, cross-reference it. And let's just say we have a request type, so we know what they did. Instead of just looking at the abstract, they actually downloaded the PDF or the HTML. Let's just say that we have that data. Not sure. So, okay, so this is a typical server log that you would obtain, and it in fact has that data. It's like a 2007 record. See, here's the date and timestamp. Right. This is actually I think this is a copy of the ADS log. Michael Kurtz actually is a collaborator of mine. Okay, so what we have is now it gets interesting, right? So here's a document. We know when the document has been, a request has been issued for the document. We know what kind of request, we know the time it has been requested at, right? With a little bit of luck, we might even have a session identifier, which means that these events are not separated, but we actually know that the user issued a request for one document, and within the same session, they requested a request for another document. Let's just say we have that data. Just speculating that it might be possible. Okay, so now we can string these together, right? We can string this now. We've got clickstream data. Not just usage data, but clickstream data. And what can we do with that kind of clickstream data? Well, we could do quite a bit. Quite a bit. You know, I've read it somewhere that online, you know, the trails that you leave, they need about 3 data points to identify you uniquely. 3 or 4. First name, sex, age, zip code, they're done. Let's say they don't have your first name, they might still identify you. Because there aren't that many 42-year-old males that live in zip code 47401. There you go, I just identified me. Anyway, so in measure product, what we try to do is that the problem is that a lot of this usage data is siloed. So you've got libraries scrubbing it, right? You've got it's tied to a particular community. But the data becomes, that's what I was trying to argue right now, the data becomes much more valuable when you start to cross-reference it. You put one on top of the other, right? So you have zip code data. You've got a little snippet of how old someone is, or a bracket of how old they are. You've got another database where you know their sex. You overlay it all, and you've got a unique personal identification system, right? So with usage data, it's the same way. If you can cross-reference all of this, so let's just say you've got these kind of logs for one library, you've got them for another library, and then you might have them for Elsevier or Thomson Reuters, and you cross-reference all of it, you get a pretty good idea of what people were reading, when they were reading it, and what they read after, which other thing they read. So there's been quite a few efforts to analyze counter data. We've got usage data, we got counter project. Now the counter project looks at statistics, so that they're not getting involved in the session ID and all that. Just kind of how often something has been downloaded, and then you have my own project, Measure, which I'm very proud of. I think it's absolutely fantastic work there. And I'll give you some of those results. And then you get PLOS1, which is, but the problem with PLOS1 though is that they only have usage data for their own website, their own PLOS website, right? So it's not universal, it's not cross-reference. The only thing you know is people who came to our website downloaded this paper a lot. That's different. Counter, on the other hand, is trying to collect all of this usage data that's focused only on counts, right? Now, you know, most of you know Counter, right? There's a lot of libraries that actually provide this kind of data to libraries. And, you know, we've actually done some work on defining a usage impact factor. The only problem with this kind, it has all of the disadvantages, by the way, of the regular impact factor statistically, because you take all of these usage counts, right? Very skewed distribution, you calculate an average. It's like an impact factor, but based on a different data set. Very tricky. Got PLOS1, what you learn is this paper has been used a lot, which is also a cool indicator, but there's a lot more that you can do with it. And that's what we've been arguing with the Measure project for quite a while, because the website, I suck at website design, and it's really expensive to get it done well. And so our website's always been universally horrible. But to give you an overview of what Measure did in its heyday is that we took data from multiple sources. No, not one library, not two libraries, but entire library consortia. And not one library consortium, but many. Is it consortia? Is that the plural of consortium? Okay, thank you. So many library consortia. Parsed all of that data, inserted into the database, a semantic web database, cross-referenced all of the RDFs, right? And on the basis of an ontology, and then analyzed that network based on the network science that I just outlined, where you don't just calculate how often something's been used, you actually calculate how it has been used, and you calculate these random walk metrics, these betweenness metrics that you can use to get a very fine sense of the impact of a journal based on its usage. Not just on the total amount of usage, but actually the topology of the network that is woven by all of the relationships reflected by that usage that you aggregated. So here's an example of the kind of things that you can do. We published this in already 5 years ago, and I still think it's one of the prettiest maps of science I've seen. The circles here are journals. When they're connected, it doesn't mean that one cites the other a lot. It means that people who read this journal, articles in this journal, very often, or were very likely to read articles in this journal, because we've got the clickstream data, so we can do this. So this is a little bit like Amazon.com saying, hey, you bought this article, perhaps you'd like to buy this article as well, because a lot of people before you, they bought them together. That's kind of what this map reflects. It's a map of science not based on citation data, but a map of science based on usage and clickstream data. Very, very large scale. We were talking about 1 billion usage events in our databases at the time. Absolutely huge. And where did that usage data come from? It came from library consortia, California State University, all of their libraries, the University of California system donated all their logs, Thomson Reuters, Elsevier, Ingenta. I could sum up a whole bunch of them. Sort of the biggest donated their log data to this project, which we then analyzed, highly confidentially, of course. I mean, I'm a big stickler for online privacy, so we made sure that all of it was that the identifiers that were in the data were anonymous, while still retaining the information that we needed to conduct our analysis, in particular the session identifier. But you can have anonymous session identifier. You don't need an IP address or anything like that. Now, once you have a map like that, you can do something other, which I'm very proud of, and I think it still stands as one of the most interesting results in this area. So we took the citation networks that we had because we had the Web of Science. We had a whole Web of Science in storage as well. Analyzed the citation network for that. Then we took our usage data, and we calculated a whole bunch of impact metrics, like the ones that I outlined before, on these different kind of networks. And now we've got kind of battle of the metrics. And I know this is kind of difficult to get, but if, let's just say there's something out there, and we call it temperature. And you get different ideas of how to measure it. And people say, oh, no, you should just touch it. Touch it if it hurts. That means it's very warm. Okay, great, that's a metric. That's a metric. Touch it, it hurts, warm. Doesn't hurt, cold. Okay, that's a metric, right? Not a very good one. Okay? And someone says, no, you need more than one person. You need to replicate it. So have 6 people touch it, and if they all burn their hands, it's hot. Okay, that's another metric. Okay, now we could figure that. If someone says, listen, I've got this theory, but things expand when they get hot, so we'll just look at how expanded the thing is, and it'll give us a pretty good metric. And everybody will say, well, there's no theory. You haven't defined temperature. You don't even know what temperature is, and you're measuring it. Right? Now, that's what people in psychology do. Same with intelligence. To measure someone's intelligence, I could have them memorize Bible verses. Is that an indicator of intelligence? It could be. Memory is related to intelligence to some degree, or the ability to learn is, right? It's not a very good one, but it is a metric. Oh, why don't we look at cranium capacity, right? That's probably not a very good one, okay? But we can do all of these things without even defining what intelligence is. This is kind of tricks that social scientists play. So what we did in this analysis is that we looked at all kinds of possible ways using network science and using existing metrics and off-the-shelf metrics, and we calculated different impact measurements from the same data, one a citation network and one a usage network, and then we compared the measurements. And we actually examined the differences by the results yielded by those metrics using a principal component analysis, which told us the dimensions along which the result of those metrics varied when applied to the same data. Make sense? I'm getting so many angry stares right now. Well, but again, what we're doing is we're comparing the results, right? So we have the same object at the same temperature, hopefully. We have people coming out and say, hot, right? And then we've got another group of people going and say, yeah, it's kind of hot. Okay, we've got a difference now. Which of these metrics is right? Right? Well, at the very least, we can study the differences between these metrics and hope that we get a little closer to what hotness or temperature really is like and how to best measure it. That's what we did here. We calculated about 40 different metrics, some of them based on citation data, some based on usage data, and they did a principal component analysis. The white ones are the usage metrics. So, of course, they cluster because they're based on the same network. But something very interesting. The black dots here are the citation metrics. And the blue one here is the impact factor. Number 5. See how it should be right there, right? It should be central. It should be the king of metrics, given how it's being used. It's not. It's actually on the outskirts of this galaxy. Which are the king of metrics? It's number 22 and 21. And if I remember correctly, that's citation between the centrality. That comes closest to some kind of a universal notion of what impact really means. 19 and 20, that's the page rank. That's page rank. So those metrics come very close to what we really mean when we say that something has high impact. Same thing with this object that has a temperature. This is where all of the metrics that we have, expansion, laying on of the hands, etc., agree that this has high temperature, right? So that's what we have here in terms of impact metric. But also note one thing: the distance in this space between the impact factor and those metrics is larger than those impact factors to these usage metrics. In addition to that, there's patterns that we can see. On the x-axis, that's the first principal component, which explains the greatest degree of variation between these metrics. And 2 and 3 right here, if you look at it, are the immediacy index. So very early citations are being used for this. Right? And so that gives 15, 14, and 13 are, let me look it up, is a sort of citation index, so total mass of citations in degree of centrality. So this dimension could be related to fast versus slow indicators. Immediate indicators and sort of more integral let's take all the citations and add them up and not bother with time kind of indicators. Okay, that's what you would expect because of the usage indicators being on the right side, right? But what about the y-axis, the second principal component? Now, that's where it gets a little interesting. These are all sort of counting metrics. Let's count number of citations divided by, normalized, and so on. But these are all counting metrics. The ones at the top, above the 0 line, right, are network science metrics. Metrics that measure impact from network structure, okay? So what that tells us is that these usage metrics measure sort of this network sense of impact, and they do it quickly. You don't have to agree. You know, just with principal component analysis, the analysis does not tell you what the dimensions mean, right? Oh, I forgot about these annotations on the graph. Okay, good. Now, I won't go into the actual, we set up a website. You can actually explore all these metrics and all that. It's no longer defined. I think I'm running out. How much time do I have left? Like a couple of minutes? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to rush through this. This is simple stuff. Okay, so okay. Take it 10 minutes. Yeah, I can do it. So, okay, so let me show you something else that we did. So we're looking at this kind of usage data. But the truth is, when we started working the measure project, it was 2009, and usage data was still very radical, very revolutionary. But slowly but surely, if you look at social media, a lot of scholarly communication, right, has really been happening in these social media environments to a much larger degree than we think. Now, the reliability might be very low, but the scale is enormous. And so what I noticed is that, so this is a graph that shows you sort of the response to a paper. I think it's actually one, I can't remember exactly, but I think it's one that I published. And what we did is we posted the paper in archive. Within a week, that paper saw a huge spike of Twitter mentions and Google downloads. Google queries. It had about 70,000 pages that were mentioning that paper within a week. Huge response immediately, right? And then shortly after, you could see the archive downloads start to peak as well. And then you had a little bit of a decay, a little bit of a few spikes, you know, depending on whether I was interviewed about the paper or not, right? But clearly you see that we've got a very immediate response, we've got a strong response, right? And we might be able to use this to measure impact, assuming that people don't pass around papers they hate, right? So that's exactly what we did. So we looked at a cohort of papers that were published in archive for a 6-month period. And then we looked at the number of times they were mentioned on Twitter and how often they were downloaded on archive. And we also compared it to early citation rates, about 6 or 7 months later. See the timelines right there, right? And then we use a very simple multivariate linear regression model to determine which of these factors contributed the most to citation statistics. And what we found is statistically significant, very strongly statistically significant effects of Twitter mentions relative to later early citation data. I think Gunther Eisenbach has actually shown the same thing. Papers that are mentioned a lot on Twitter will gather more citations later on, which is also very, I mean, kind of fit the mold of the research that we've been doing in the sense that you can look at Twitter sentiment and predict stock market fluctuations on that basis, but at the scale of 3 or 4 days, not at the scale of 7 or 8 months. Right? Strong results, not perfect, but there's quite a few companies like Total Impact, as a number of groups working on refining these kind of metrics. They're all based on what they call them alt metrics. I don't like that term, alternative metrics. I mean, alternative to what? I mean, what if they become accepted? Are they still alternative? It's like REM, right? They were first alternative, and then I mean, what were they? It's like, I mean, it's like U2. You know, once you start hanging with the Dalai Lama, you're no longer alternative, you know. Anyway, but you've got people working on these alt metrics, and they're making a lot of progress in establishing at least the case that you might be able to use these kind of indicators to get a very quick idea of what matters in science. So you got citation data reflecting science as it existed 2 years ago. You got usage data reflecting what people are interested in right now. But then you've got these social media environments where people are giving you an explicit record of what they're interested in because they're saying, you should look at this. And if people retweet it, that's a pretty strong indicator of the value of something, right? I mean, there's Mendeley, for example, is publishing readership statistics as well. It's a totally different way. But again, you've got this online ecology of social media social media sort of attention data. That's what it really is. Perhaps not impact, but attention. I know I'm going to get some questions for you saying, well, what you're really measuring is attention. Yeah, but think about it. That's citation as well. It's all attention, right? It's the basic measure. Okay, now for something. Okay, now I'm going to do it again. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. 3 minutes of what I think is a pretty radical proposal to change science funding as we know it for the better, and change all of the scientific incentives that I've been talking about so far, and merge them into one single system that might cure a lot of these, what ailed science. By the way, how many of you know this video? Awesome, right? I was watching it last night because I needed a screenshot to start laughing again. This is it's like a retrospective on the career of this group, Spinal Tap, and they started off, this is their mod period, and the song is Give Me Some Money. And I always think of that song when I'm applying for NSF grants. You know, like the lyrics go, you know what I want, don't, don't. Oh, maybe you don't. Anyway, so here's how science is funded right now on the left. Okay, we've got Congress, and their infinite wisdom make all kinds of decisions about how much money should be spent on scientific research, preferably focused on the kind of things that they care about, right? So, you know, it's like that movie, The Wizard of Oz, right? You know, the color is yellow, and everybody dresses up in yellow, and then it's green, right? So brain research, everybody. Anyway, so they hand out the dollars. They go into the coffers of the funding agencies. And I'm making it sound horrible, but it is true. I mean, society democratically likes to exert at least some influence on how their tax dollars are being spent. That's not onerous. That's just how it is. That money goes to funding agencies. The funding agencies set up this system, right? And again, I always think about what would an alien think if I landed on Earth as an alien and they would explain this model to me, how this works, right? Would I understand? Would I think, oh yeah, it's a totally reasonable way to do things? I try to do it with everything, right? So that's what my explanation here is kind of trying to get at. If an alien were in the audience, I'd try to explain how this works. So the funding agencies take that money and they don't know who to give it to. They don't know who to give it to. So what they do is they essentially say, hey, why don't you, all of you science people, why don't you write some proposals and tell us how you're going to use the money? And then we're going to look at those proposals. We're going to get all these reviewers to DC, wherever they are, and they're going to look at your proposals and give us the thumbs up and thumbs down. Thumbs up, you get money. Thumbs down, you get nothing. Okay? And then the award starts flowing to the investigators, and everybody's happy because it's rock solid, it's peer-reviewed. I mean, could it be better, right? Or could it? The idea here is that all of these people writing proposals, 15, 20 pages, right? If you look at the hourly rate of a professor in most universities, let's assume it's $100 gross per hour, right? Not me. Consulting rates can actually be triple or quadruple. So the market rate for the hourly services of a professor are much higher than that. So the university is getting a great deal, right? So, but let's just say it's $100. I spend, let's say, 3 weeks of my time, full-time working on a proposal with 3 colleagues. That's a good chunk of money. The success rate of many funding agencies in the US now is like 1 out of 10. Anywhere between 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10. So let's just say I have to do it 5 times. My colleagues and I have spent $200,000 of our time to get a $120,000 grant. That makes no sense. The university should prohibit us from applying for grants. Really? If you think about it. I can see some eye rolling going on there. Okay, so, but they should prohibit us from applying for grants, if you think about it. So, but our time is free. They pay us wages, so then they don't care if I spend the entire weekend working on a grant, right? It's free. My time is essentially, from that point on, it's free. Okay, but still, from sort of an efficiency perspective, that matters. So here's what we propose. Remember PageRank? About impact passing through the network and all of that, and being handed over from Albert Einstein to me, and then I handed over to the lesser gods of science, right? Why don't we do that with money? Mathematically, we could show it will converge. Mathematical work just like PageRank. And it has a whole bunch of other very favorable features. So let's just say that Congress has the money. Instead of going through the funding agencies, they just dump it in the scientific community. Like a free-for-all, no questions asked, just money. Okay? So what would happen? Now, how can we set up a process that gives us good outcomes? Okay, so here's what we propose. Take all that money and split it equally. You've got 100,000 scientists, and you've got $10 billion. Spread it out equally. By the way, that's a lot of money per person. Think about it. That's a lot of money per scientist. No wasting of time, no writing proposals, no peer reviewing, no call for proposals, no workshops to determine the call for proposals, no program directors writing call for proposals. None of that, none of that. None of it. Everybody gets an equal chunk, okay? So that's the dollars divided by N. And that's what arrives in my account, my research account every year. Free money. Have to do nothing for it. No questions asked. That's free money. I'm a big fan of free money. Especially if it's not coming out of my wallet. Okay, so ends up in my account. But on one condition. You get that money, but a certain fraction of that you have to pay forward. Every year you have to log into a website, or every 6 months, and you take 50% of what you received and donate it to other scientists that you think could make better use of the money. Okay? You have to. Now, what happens, some of these scientists receive two things. They receive the base amount that everybody gets, but they also receive donations from other scientists. So, for example, if a lot of people like me, I might get $300,000. Well, guess what? Now I have to donate, not $50,000 out of the $100,000 I received. I have to donate $150,000. I become like a little funding agency myself. The more money you receive, the more you have to give. If you receive a lot of money, it means a lot of people think you're worthy of the money, right? Well, then you should also be worthy of passing it on to other people. So what happens is that if you look at the equations, you end up, I won't go into the math here because I'm running out of time, but what you get is PageRank. If it works for Google, why couldn't it work for science funding? Now, the money, on the other hand, would be a token of influence in the system of circulating money. So all of the scholarly evaluation stuff wouldn't be necessary. Would be for the dean just looks at the account and say, Johan's got $1 million, this guy's got only his base amount. Nobody gave any money to this guy, but Johan received $1 million from a bunch of people who liked his research. So you've got the evaluation, you've got the metrics, you've got the funding, you've got all of that folded into one and the same system. It will end up with a situation where some people have a lot of money and some people only have that base amount of money. But that's fine. That's exactly what we have now too. Actually, we have a very skewed distribution where you've got a bunch of fat cats getting a lot of money all the time. And because they get a lot of money, they've got huge research teams, they get more money. Because they can write all those proposals, but perhaps they're not even writing them themselves. And you've got a lot of people stuck with nothing, not even that base amount. So this system has a lot of really interesting features. I'm putting the hard sell on you guys, but everybody gets a base amount of funding. So the death spiral of not having the money to do any work, and because you're not doing any work, you can't do the work, you can't hire people to do the work, and because you're not doing it, and you're spending all your time writing research proposals, so you're not doing the work, and again, the death spiral of research that a lot of young faculty might get into. You don't have that. Everybody gets a base amount. There will be no poverty-stricken professors. Get that base amount, okay? Science funding, not wages. It's also very robust. Instead of having funding decisions made by 3 or 4 reviewers to give you a thumbs up and down, the entire community votes with their dollars on whether they think your research is interesting or not. Right? It's also responsive. People change their minds and say, well, this whole graphene stuff, that hype, I'm tired of graphene. Don't talk to me about graphene anymore. I'm going to put my money elsewhere, more interesting things. Right? String theory, we've been doing that for 40 years. Forget it. I'm going to give my money to some other physicist. Right? Well, it immediately changes. It's also very efficient. All I have to do is just log into the NSF website and just type in Johan Bollen, everything. And I'm done. So you do need, I will say this, you need conflict of interest and certification in this system, right? Who are the scientists that pass this money around? That's one thing. And who can they donate to legally? Now, but we have that with peer review. When a proposal submitted by one of my proteges or PhD students or former collaborators being discussed, I excuse myself from the room. I'm not even involved. I will be pacing back and forth so that people see me. I'll be staring. I'll be doing all of that. But other than that, no conflict of interest involved at all. So anyway, so I won't go into this. We actually simulated this. We took 20 years of Web of Science data, and we pretended like every single author in our database had a pot of money and was passing it along. Now, we don't know who they would give it to, but we have their citations. So we use the citations as sort of a proxy of who they might give it to. We're not advocating using citation data for this. We're just saying that we use that as the data was available, and it gave us an idea of who they would give the money to. And what we found is that when we looked at the actual, we had the data on NSF and NIH funding at the PI level. And yeah, I know this is horrible. I think some of the people on our team are colorblind. I'm referring to myself. So that's how you get graphs like this. This is a heat map. This is the actual NSF and NIH funding per PI. And this is what we calculated they would have received by our system. Now, this is a strong correlation. There's scatter. There's a lot of scatter. That could be the unreliability of the existing system or a problem with our simulation. Right? But still, just on crazy. I mean, you're thinking I'm crazy now because of this proposal, right? But so we calculated crazy and compared it to supposedly not crazy, and we got a pretty good correlation. So think about that. The other thing is that we worked with different redistribution rates. So clearly, if everybody keeps their base rate, everybody's got the base rate. It's total communism, right? You don't have to give anything. You have to give anything, and you keep your base rate. Everybody's got exactly the same amount of funding, right? Or you could force them to give 99% of what they received, which is total meritocracy, right? You keep $1 out of $100 that you receive, but you have to give everything away. And these distributions become much more steep or flat, depending on what this F value looks like. And at an F of about 50% is when we have the best overlap with the existing distribution of science funding, according to our data at least, when it pertains to NIH and NSF. So anyway, I just wanted to conclude with that because I just want to show you that these kind of computational, that kind of computational thinking I've been showing you can make tremendous contributions in scholarly assessment, the science of science, tracking of scientific research and research trends, and in addition to that, might actually point the way towards finally leveraging all of these great algorithms that we have to do better than just counting citations and putting those numbers in the hands of administrators and having to make decisions about tenure, promotion, what have you. We have the tools, right? We finally have the tools and the science to really make significant improvements, not just to how we evaluate science, but how we fund it and how we stop wasting time, our faculty's time, our scientists' time, with having to chase after money like they have to do right now. It's actually a really terrible waste of time and effort and public resources. So quickly, that's kind of my conclusion. I won't go into all of this. I will say this, though. Again, I mentioned the gift economy of science in the beginning. A funding system that treats scientists like contractors is antithetical to this notion of science as a gift economy. Right? If I want to have the kitchen renovated, I have people submit proposals to me. I'll look at the cheapest and best ones, and those will repair the kitchen. And then afterwards go, you didn't do X, you didn't do Y, I'm not paying you, to get into disputes like that, right? Like that's the Coburn report. We gave them $100,000, they put shrimps on treadmills. And that's the situation you get. You pay for services, but that's not how science works. Well, should work, perhaps. Anyway, so I've given you a little bit of a glimpse of the radical that I am. I've been talking for an hour. I apologize. I mean, I understand how horrible that must have been. Here's a list of papers. I'd be more than willing to send you copies of them. A lot of them are actually available in PLOS1 or in archive. Sorry, no stock tips today. That's all I have.
We have some time for questions, and Deb has a microphone that we can just pass over to everyone.
That's right here. So, in relation to the Twitter mentions, driving prediction of whether or not something would, but it doesn't have a lot to do with if your profession tends to have people who are on Twitter or not, and I think there's, right? Yeah. So it's a predictor of things that might in the future have citations, but not everything that had citations in the future will have necessarily had Twitter. But it might evolve as Twitter becomes the platform, or there's another platform, right?
Yeah, I will say that there's 500 million people on Twitter right now. That's more than there are people in the United States.
Has anyone done anything to sort of map the sciences that or disciplines where Twitter is
more prevalent?
Versus others?
I sort of out of the top of my head, I can't. I think I've seen a study like that, and yes, certain domains will be overrepresented relative to others. So, I'm not advocating using this as a metric. Again, I don't want to take this to the dean And all of these metrics, I will say this, though, I've focused a lot on impact metrics in my research, and I kind of regret it, to be honest. Because for us, it was a scientific exercise in trying to prove something that was obviously broken. And I'm interested in studying scientific impact. I'm not interested in offering administrators a tool to bludgeon scientists with. So your points are well taken. I think it's a very partial and biased indicator, but it's nevertheless interesting that something as obviously flawed as just Twitter mentions actually do seem to have a little bit of predictive effect with respect to citations. So I offer the observation from that perspective. Not saying that we should use this, because it's the same with citations, by the way. Some fields are very poorly represented in the journal citation reports. And we've got the social science, but even there, that doesn't fix it. I think it's like 10% of all citations originate from the humanities and the social sciences. It's clearly not a great situation.
So how do you take into account the fact that the network is biased? So, for example, women and minorities in science get cited less, they get funding less. Does your work take that into account?
No, not specifically. And I will say this, though, it depends on your, perhaps I shouldn't go into this, but I like systems that treat everyone equally and then solve these kinds of issues not by mandates or requirements, but solve them computationally. I like systems that remove those kind of biases. So the funding system I just mentioned essentially removes that bias, because it really does. Because if you've got a review panel of 6 dudes looking at a proposal that is written by a young female scientist, I've never seen it, but it's possible that there might be some kind of a bias that is not expressed and leads to lower funding rates. In this system, you don't have a review panel of 6 old dudes. What you have is a review panel that comprises the entire scientific community. So you would hope that these kind of biases have much less power to reflect themselves in funding numbers, etc. So, but your point is well taken, right? I'm not in favor of minorities or underrepresented groups being funded less. Clearly, that's heinous. But I think with these kind of systems, with the money circulating, even indirectly. So if I give you, let's just say I decide not to give you funding because I'm sexist, or I've got a bias against women. Let's just say that's true, and I would give it to you. Well, you might not have that bias. So the money flows. The money flows. It trickles. The entire scientific community is involved in this funding enterprise. So some groups might have biases, but the network kind of bypasses those groups, especially if they become less productive. Because, again, the system is very easy. You log in, say, money, I send my money to this person, but from there on, it starts to percolate through the entire community. So I think that it has much less, the biases in this case are not institutionalized because there is no institution. So I have not convinced you, but you're going, no. No. But that's how these systems work. The system works by having no central authority where these biases can become powerful enough. The money circulates. It circulates continuously. And whereas there's bias, the flow of funding bypasses those biases to some degree. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. Because I wouldn't know how to fix a situation like that other by sort of very strong mandates, but then you've got another number of potentially harmful hazards that you incur. So I sympathize, I really do. But that's exactly what, to some degree, that's what the system is trying to solve. But yeah, I can see that's enough.
Maybe for one more question.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.